And let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So before we begin, we want to make sure everyone can access interpretation and closed captioning if you need it. You can access interpretation by clicking on interpretation on your control panel and selecting Spanish. To access closed captioning, click on live transcript at the bottom of your screen. These captions are auto-generated, so please understand if there are any mistakes. Pueden acceder la interpretación en español haciendo clic en Interpretation en la parte inferior de la pantalla y escogiendo Spanish. Y pueden ver los subtítulos haciendo clic en Live Transcript en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Y vamos a esperar un momento. We're going to give everyone a moment to do that. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. So if you are using the closed captions or interpretation, please rename yourself with CC for captions or ES for Spanish before your name. We have an example. This helps us make sure you go in the right place when we do breakout groups. And if you have any trouble renaming yourself in Zoom, let us know in the chat and one of us can help rename you. So we'll also take a moment for renaming. Okay, again, any questions, please feel free to let us know in the chat, and I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so for any of you joining by phone, just a reminder, you can use *6 to mute and unmute yourself. So when we have breakouts, you can participate that way. And for everyone during breakouts, please remember to participate verbally instead of in the chat if you do have a phone participant, as best as you can so everyone can participate. Okay, thank you. So now on this slide, we are seeing the posters that some of you received if you signed up for this event kind of early on in the registration period. So we have the ACLU is on Indigenous land. And we wanted to first talk a little bit about the new ACLU land acknowledgement and how that came about. So if you have this piece of art with you, that features our new land acknowledgement. So the process for the ACLU of Northern California to reach our land acknowledgement statement was critical to the creation of the statement itself. We wanted to engage across our organization in this ongoing practice to recognize the Indigenous peoples who came before us and who continue to fight today. There was an internal committee working on this, made up of staff and board members that identify as Indigenous and of people connected to our Indigenous justice work. Based on research and guidance on land acknowledgements, in consultation with leaders, tribal leaders in our region, we drafted an institutional land acknowledgement statement. The link here is in the chat for those of you that want to see more about this process that I'm talking about. For this piece of art, we worked with a California Indian artist, Jackie Fawn, to create this visual to accompany the statement. We paid her for her work. We then sent the draft statement to more than a dozen tribal councils throughout our region with whom we have existing and sometimes long-standing relationships, along with tribally affiliated and Native-led organizations in Northern California to seek their input. We at ACLU of Northern California will continue to engage our allies, members, donors, staff, and the broader community to join us in this ongoing and reflective process of acknowledging the land we are on and the Indigenous peoples who belong to this land, and in deepening our commitment to Indigenous justice. And as a note, our institutional statement is not intended to be a script to be read from at other public events. Again, the link is in the chat for more information about the process that we went through. Okay, next slide, please. So introductions, let me start by introducing myself. My name is Katie Bettendorf. I am the Civil Liberties Intake Program Manager. My pronouns are she, her, and I live in Union City. I work out of the ACLU Northern California's San Francisco office. And we'll have the other presenters introduce themselves as well. So I'll pass it to Teddy.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Teddy Simon. I'm the Indigenous Justice Advocate in our Racial and Economic Justice Program. I'm working out of the San Francisco office vis-a-vis my home in Oakland, and I use pronouns she, her.
Okay, and Tessa?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Tessa Jaracangelo Ampersand. I use she, her pronouns, and I am based out of our Sacramento office.
And we're glad you all are here. Let's go to the next slide to talk about participation norms for this event. Okay, we have a couple we're going to go through in a little bit more detail. So number one, participate. You all are here to learn. So when we ask for participation, or when you are sent to breakout groups, or there's time for writing, there's time for reflection, please use that opportunity. Please share your thoughts, and please do the exercises. Feel free to dive into those. Number two, we practice the norm of progressive stack. This is a way to acknowledge people who have always been centered in our society, oftentimes who feel the most comfortable speaking up, and some folks who just, this is a way to acknowledge the people who have always been centered in our society, oftentimes feel the most comfortable speaking up. So we use progressive stack, where we try to call on folks whose voices are more marginalized in our society to hear their perspectives first. Okay. Number three, we want to trust and validate the experience of BIPOC people. This one is pretty straightforward. Believe people, listen well, listen with an open mind. Sometimes other people's experiences may be very different from your own, and it's on us to listen. We want to listen to the meaning behind what folks say, whether there's joy or there's pain, and to acknowledge that and to sit with it. Don't try to discount other folks' experiences or poke holes in it. Next, we use I statements. This training is about reflection and actions you are going to take. Use I statements to talk about your experience and focus on your capacity for growth and commitment. Number five, next, what is shared here stays here, and what's learned here leaves here, otherwise known as the Vegas rule. People might share personal or vulnerable stories. That's great, but these stories are not yours to share. That being said, what you learn from the stories and the insights you develop are what you can take from this space and take out into the world. Last but not least, this is an interracial, intergenerational, inter-other things space with folks from lots of different backgrounds. We want this to be a space where people can bring genuine curiosity that helps us all grow and build a more trusting community. And we know that this can be hard and it can bring up lots of feelings and it can bring up trauma. So if you are not impacted by the issue we're discussing and it brings up feelings of guilt, it brings up feeling of defensiveness, we ask that you sit with those feelings and do your best to stay in this space and learn. Okay? If you are directly impacted by the issue we are discussing or anything that comes up, the statement someone is making, and you feel triggered or something is difficult and it's inhibiting your ability to learn or your well-being in that moment, please do what you need to take care of yourself. That can include jumping off the call, reaching out for a one-on-one, or discussing your feelings that came up with someone else's statements and figuring out what we can do to be accountable. So for those of you that know Tessa has one-on-ones, and we'll have a link in the chat if you would like to book a one-on-one following this event to touch on any of these things with her. And if there's anything else participation-wise to bring to this space, I'm just going to look to Tessa and Teddy if there's anything you'd like to clarify or touch on before we go to the next slide.
I think we can go to the next slide. Thanks.
Okie dokie. All right, folks, we have 3 objectives for the remainder of this session. So number 1, to go over what is Indigenous justice. Number 2, to get into how to acknowledge the land. And then number 3, we hope to have time for small group research and reflection. And with that, I believe I'm turning it to Teddy.
Thank you, Katie, and good evening again, everyone. I think we can move to the next slide, Louise. So this might be a little repetitive or feel like really basic knowledge for some of you, but because there's so little information out there and so little accurate information about Indigenous communities, and because Indigenous people are so often ignored, it's important to kind of start with some facts and to have some common background. California is home to the largest Native American population in the nation. There are over 150 tribes in California, either with or seeking federal recognition. Those with federal recognition are sovereign nations who have treaty rights and government-to-government relations with our federal, state, and local governments. Each of these tribes has its own unique culture and traditions. Many of them speak their own languages as well. There are dozens of native languages spoken throughout the state. Between the Oregon and the US-Mexico border, there are over 100 reservations and rancherias. And in fact, most Indigenous people in California don't live on reservations. Places like Sacramento, Santa Rosa, the Bay Area have some of the largest urban Indian populations in the country. Next slide, please. It's also especially important to celebrate and be inspired by the work that tribes and Indigenous leaders are doing. So for example, following the leadership of the Sogoreete Land Trust and the Confederated Villages of the Lisjan, the city of Albany just about a month and a half ago passed a resolution to recognize the Ohlone people and explore paying land tax and giving land back. Up on the North Coast, the Yurok, Hupa, and other tribes are leading what will be the largest dam removal on Earth ever to restore the river salmon and their habitat. The Amamutsan tribal band, as some folks here are involved in, are building a really broad coalition to protect sacred sites and defend important ecosystems. And the Rename S Valley Coalition in Fresno County is working to remove racist slurs from the map. Next slide, Luis. And this is all building on decades and really centuries of California as home to incredibly inspiring Indigenous resistance and resilience. So I'll note here that when we talk about Indigenous people as a thing of the past or as history or as victims, we obscure this incredible and inspirational leadership. And it's also really important to note that the existence of Indigenous communities of this Indigenous leadership and resilience are not for lack of trying through our settler colonial system. If any of what I just shared with you was surprising or new or you'd forgotten, that's the point. Indigenous people are made invisible. So to talk about land acknowledgements, we have to put that conversation in a historical and contemporary context. And it's impossible to talk about Indigenous people today without talking about settler colonialism. Next slide. Our shared history since the time of contact is one of genocide and erasure. Spanish colonizers came to California to take Indigenous land. Indigenous people were literally worked to death building and maintaining 21 Spanish missions throughout the state. Between 1769 and 1834, approximately 150,000 California Indians died as a direct result of the mission system. And then California joined the Union and the story continued. For many years, the state of California paid white settlers to carry out massacres against Indigenous people. At one time, the state was paying $5 per head and 25 cents per scalp for killing natives. That's where the super racist and relatively recent retired Washington football team name came from. Slavery was legal here. More recently, dozens of tribal nations and treaties were terminated by the federal government. So the US kept the land, but refuses to live up to its promises, de facto erasing entire nations. So these are all pieces of our shared story that many of us don't know about. We don't teach about it. We don't talk about it. And in part, it's because it's hard to confront these issues and be reminded that we benefit from it. And it's also a continuation of genocide. According to recent research, 40% of Americans believe that Indigenous people no longer exist in the United States. Next slide. Indian education was at the heart of the United States effort to erase Native people. Thousands of children all across this country were violently taken from their homes by government officials and by law enforcement agents and sent to boarding schools from the 1850s all the way up until the 1960s, so just a generation or two ago. The motto of these schools was to kill the Indian, save the man. The purpose explicitly was to make Native children white and to systematically destroy Indigenous culture and identity. If there were no longer people who spoke the language or had a connection to their ancestral lands, there were no longer people in the way of manifest destiny. Children faced violent punishment for speaking their language or engaging in cultural traditions. And so public education remains a really deep source of intergenerational trauma today. And this isn't a thing of the past. The history of education as a tool of oppression and erasure continues today. Next slide. We probably all saw the really shocking video recently of a teacher in Riverside with a really poorly made construction paper headdress doing a ridiculous dance and whooping in her classroom, apparently teaching about trigonometry. But that's just one really overt and explicit racist example. And it's a representation of what Native American students face all the time in schools. They're not valued, they don't belong, they're not respected. Their teachings, cultures, languages are excluded, or worse, as we saw in that case, mocked and taught as myths or legends. This month, the month of November, is particularly bad for many Native students and families because it's a month where the history of the US is erased and replaced with a really nice story about pilgrims and Indians that relegates Indigenous people to the past and really obscures the horrific history that our country was founded on. So I want to actually just pause for 30 seconds and ask folks to think about your primary school experience, especially in the month of November. It's appropriate. Do you remember learning anything about Indigenous people? Do you feel like it was an accurate representation of US history? And were Native Americans talked about in the past tense only? And I'm going to pause for maybe 15 or 20 seconds, and it would be fabulous if folks feel inspired to share those experiences in the chat, because I think we can learn a lot from each other. And if you have even a word or a sentence or a short reflection that you would want to share, please do feel welcome to put that into the chat. Yes, little paper dolls, the past tense. Yep. No memory of learning anything, and Indians were only mentioned in relation to sharing food with the pilgrims and in the past tense. Yep. This is really amazing. So I think as folks are continuing to share, and please do keep sharing, I think we can kind of imagine if we were to go to school or to work or to engage in a world where every day your community is talked about as history, you're made invisible, you don't matter. That's deeply traumatizing, and that is a continuation of genocide and attempted erasure of Native people and indigeneity. So Luis, we can go to the next slide. So we see all of this very concretely in educational outcomes for Native students today. Building on 2 decades of work alongside tribal partners in the North Coast and in collaboration with the Northern California Indian Development Council. Just last year, we released this report called Failing Grade. And the findings in this report make crystal clear the connections between history and today. As some of you can see on the slide, in shockingly high numbers, Native American students in Humboldt County are leaving schools unprepared to enter the workforce. Across districts in Humboldt, Native American students are less than half as likely as their peers to graduate high school prepared for college or careers. Native students have suspension rates 5 times the state average for white students, 5 times the state average, and experience chronic absenteeism at more than double the rate of all students throughout the state. And Humboldt County just happens to be one example of what this looks like all throughout California. So next slide, please. So we see very clearly, and just in the stories that folks continue to share in the chat, settler colonialism continues to attempt to erase Indigenous society and practices and culture and communication. And this is also about fundamental differences in how we see the world and how we approach one another. Often, I think we don't even realize that we exclude Indigenous peoples in our narrative and as we move through our daily lives because it's so deeply ingrained. And so one of the things that we've lost, and we haven't been taught or socialized to realize that cultures have different ways of communicating, of interacting, that people have different ways of making decisions or prioritizing different relationships to other people and to other living beings. So we have to put in extra effort to unlearn and then learn and expand and grow in our understanding. And so this has to do with cultural humility, not taking on or appropriating the culture as our own, or necessarily even learning everything about it because it might not be ours to learn, but being aware of the differences, building relationships and adjusting our approaches. And a lot of that starts with our own education. So next slide. As we at the ACLU build out our Indigenous justice work, we're trying to be really intentional about our approach. We've developed these guiding principles for our work, and we check back in constantly to ask ourselves, are we lifting up Indigenous people? Are we following the lead of tribal nations? Are we honoring Indigenous values in these different ways of seeing and being? Or are we inadvertently trampling them because we've internalized all of this dominant culture too? And these can be hard questions. So we keep asking them as we grow our Indigenous justice work. And that work today includes a commitment to Indigenous education equity, to supporting land back and the protection of sacred sites, and supporting Indigenous leaders to work towards accurate representation and visibility. And as we stop to reflect, we're trying to teach ourselves first and trying to move at the pace of relationship. We're also aware that we're going to make mistakes and we try and learn from them and rectify them. And we strive to put the relationships, not the outcomes, first, ensuring that Indigenous voices, perspectives, and solutions are at the forefront of our work. So next slide, please. We're going to pause here. This is taken from the Sogoreté Land Trust kind of framing and guiding on how to come correct. And especially in the context of Native American heritage months, where I think a lot of Native American people are asked to come speak and talk and teach. Folks are asked, before you ask us, ask yourself, how have you benefited from stolen land? What is your relationship to our work, the our here being Indigenous people? And what is the intention of your request? We'll have more time to come back for reflection. And for now, I will pass it over to Tessa.
Tessa, try again. It says you're unmuted. Can we not hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry, everyone. My Zoom screen is completely frozen. So I had no control to unmute myself. So I can't see the screen, Louise. So just FYI, maybe Teddy, if you could help advance slides if there's a pause. So for those who are joining by phone and like me can't see the screen, there's a cartoon here from The Simpsons of a native speaker, and the quote is really poking fun at, in this case, the outdoor industry, but I think it's relevant to all of us, especially when we ask Native people to do a land acknowledgement. It says, outdoor industry, oh, please do a land acknowledgement. Then the native speaker in the cartoon goes on stage and says, okay, give the land back. And then it has an expletive, which starts with an F and ends with uckers. And this cartoon is funny, but what it's really illustrating and what we're going to talk about now is that for land acknowledgements to be meaningful, they have to be a form of justice, and they have to be about what you or your group are actually doing to decolonize in the present and in the future. So land acknowledgements are about actions, not about statements. And we're going to talk about how to do that respectfully. Before we talk about what goes into a land acknowledgement, we need to talk about why we are doing it in the first place. And that's because we need to be really grounded in making sure that we are creating land acknowledgements that are meaningful. We all live on stolen, occupied, and unceded land that was taken from Indigenous peoples by extreme violence, forced removal, and genocide. All of us. And the history of the United States is one of attempting to completely erase Indigenous existence, as Teddy really just covered. And explicit federal and state policies have furthered genocide, they've furthered assimilation, and we benefit from that. So land acknowledgements offer us an opportunity to counter the so-called doctrine of discovery that we're taught in school as part of our standard American history curriculum by naming the true story of the people who are already here, by naming what happened to them and what was done to them through settler colonialism. And it is a process, land acknowledgements are a process that remind us that colonization is an ongoing process and that we all have a responsibility to intervene. And it's also important that we use land acknowledgements as an opportunity to counter the narrative people that Native people only exist in the past. And this can really help us to begin to repair relationships with Native communities and with the land by offering recognition and respect. And it's a way that we can support larger truth-telling and reconciliation efforts that are ongoing and led by Indigenous people, and really shine light and attention and energy onto the organizing and the advocacy that Indigenous people are doing. So land acknowledgement should inspire ongoing action. They should be about relationship. And finally, with land acknowledgements, we can take a cue from Indigenous protocols and cultures by opening up our spaces with reverence and respect for the place that we're in. So what is a land acknowledgement? A land acknowledgement is oftentimes offered at the opening to a meeting, a ceremony, or some other public event. They've become increasingly common. So I imagine many of you have heard a land acknowledgement. If you've joined an ACLU training, you've probably heard a land acknowledgement. And this can be also a written statement that is included in a physical space. So the land acknowledgement that became part of the art that you all, or that many of you received in the mail, will go up in our offices at the ACLU. And that's a written statement that we worked on to acknowledge the land, acknowledge the people, and also inherently includes their history and their culture and a relationship that we built with tribal communities in our region. So there are 4 essential components. First, specifically naming the Native people of the land you occupy, and being really clear about whose land you're actually on. Second, being aware of and being explicit about the history of genocide and violence without whitewashing it. Third, it must also be rooted in the present, including the ongoing harms of colonialism. And finally, there must be a commitment within the land acknowledgement and beyond the land acknowledgement to what you and your group are doing to repair those harms. So some things to consider. There are, as Teddy mentioned, 574 federally recognized tribes and hundreds of tribes with state recognition or who are unrecognized in the US today. However, all treaties have been broken and Indigenous peoples continue to be colonized. Media depictions of Native Americans rarely exist and are almost never contemporary or positive. And we, in our collective imagination, as you all pointed to in the chat, talking about your school education, think of Native people as history. So your land acknowledgement should compel you and others to do something to flip this narrative and to address this. So a couple considerations as you begin this process. First, you should be in relationship with Indigenous people and really be ready to commit to what that relationship calls you to do. That can be financial resources, volunteer time, or supporting campaigns and advocacy that tribes are leading. Secondly, you should speak from your personal perspective as a settler, even if you are a member of an impacted community too. We're all, many of us, impacted in different ways by different issues, but that doesn't mean that your impact can erase somebody else's experiences. You should do your research and make sure you're using accurate historical information. And to have a healthy relationship, both parties need to really heal historic trauma. And so you should really be ready to dive into that and embrace that process. Next slide. All right. So the first step in starting a land acknowledgement is self-reflection. And here are some questions to ask yourself as you consider starting a land acknowledgement practice. How much have I reflected on how I am a beneficiary of settler colonialism and the displacement of Indigenous peoples? Am I actively incorporating Indigenous justice into my work and life? And if not, how can I do this? What is my intention and goal in offering a land acknowledgement and implementing a land acknowledgement practice? What do I know about Indigenous peoples today? Did I do more than visit a curated site with a map to identify the Indigenous people that once inhabited the land I'm on? Did I learn about those people's history and culture, where they are today, and what some of the key issues that they're facing and are leading on? And you don't have to have a definitive or good answer to these questions. These are really big questions. They're the types of lifelong reflecting questions and work that we should all be doing to contribute to healthy movements. So we will put these into the chat and we'll give you some time later to think about them as well. The next step is self-education about who is in your region without relying on Indigenous people to do that work for you. So one, you really need to do your homework, and that includes identifying who the Indigenous people are in your area, both prior to contact and today, and learn how to pronounce the Indigenous names appropriately. We use a resource often, and you might have seen this, we put it in the chat for folks before, which is native-land.ca. That's a website, and it's a great resource for naming the native tribal lands and territories you occupy, but it also has many limitations that you should be aware of, specifically that Indigenous history changed over time prior to contact, and any map is going to really be about a snapshot in time. So it's inherently erasing a lot of that history and trying to capture who is on the land at just that singular time without really showing how people had migrated and moved and histories had changed over time. So use that link with caution as you move forward. Step 3 is articulating the why. It's important that you make a land acknowledgement meaningful by articulating why it matters. What has happened as a result of colonialism? Why is this important in this particular time and place and for the audience for which you've written this land acknowledgement? Why does it matter to you today? What's happening in that particular moment in our collective history that is associated with colonialism? What about this matters to the gathering or the institution where you are speaking? And what additional information should you consider providing to your audience? These are all really important questions. And I think also point to the fact, if we haven't made this clear yet, that you should be, when you go about writing a land acknowledgement or presenting a land acknowledgement, doing that for every particular instance. It's not okay to just do one land acknowledgement one time and say, okay, I've done my work. It's about an ongoing process. And finally, in the 4th step is a call to commitment. And this is absolutely critical. What is our commitment individually and organizationally to Indigenous justice work, which we necessarily take on when we acknowledge our history as settler colonizers who are on occupied land? Since one main purpose of incorporating land acknowledgements into our public events and public consciousness is to combat the invisibility of Indigenous peoples and the rewriting of our shared history to make Indigenous peoples a thing of the past, if we do not put that intent of the land acknowledgement into practice, the land acknowledgement itself loses its power and meaning. Deliver the land acknowledgement, invite your audience to join you, not only in acknowledging the land that they occupy, but in committing to Indigenous justice and in righting that wrong. So those are the 4 steps. And you may also be asking, well, if it's not enough to just acknowledge the land, then what can I do? So hopefully you are taking away from our training tonight in our workshop that offering a land acknowledgement compels us to also take action and to build relationships. And what this looks like depends so much on who the Indigenous people in your community and region are, what their priorities and needs are, what active campaigns and movements are afoot. But here are a few broad suggestions that you can start to think about. You can give your time and money to support Indigenous organizations and tribes in your region. You can support Indigenous-led movements and campaigns. You can actively bring your colleagues and friends and family along with you in providing support. You can build relationships based on respect and that move at a pace that's appropriate for Indigenous peoples. And you can also find and attend cultural events, cultural centers, Indigenous Peoples' Day commemorations as that's appropriate, and you're invited to do so. And you can also commit to returning the land. And that is a whole workshop that we could really get into and talk about what it means to give the land back. And since we don't have time for that tonight, we're just going to share this link in the chat to Sogorea Land Trust, which provides some examples and initial resources for you to start thinking about what it means to give back land that was stolen in the first place. Okay, so now we wanted to give you some time to do small group research and reflection and to really use this space and time to start your own practice around land acknowledgements. So a couple of questions, which we'll put into the chat and then also send once you're in your breakouts, is to first identify whose land you occupy. Learn about the relationship of your own family line to stolen land, and see if there's like very specific lines of history in your own family. You can ask yourself how you have benefited from stolen land. What is your relationship to the work of Indigenous communities? You can ask yourself about the specific history of Indigenous people from your region. What campaigns or movements exist in your community? I'm sure, as always, we have a lot of people from the Bay Area, and there's a lot to learn about the Bay Area, but there's also really important work happening in the Central Coast. And in the Central Valley, and in the North Coast, in Sacramento. So really wherever you are in what's known as California, there are amazing campaigns happening, and we encourage you to spend some of this time in your small groups to start researching that and looking it up. And in your small groups, you can really kind of ask one another questions, reflect, talk about what you're thinking about, provide one another ideas of search terms that you can use in Google to start to dig into some of these questions. So we're going to give you about 7 to 10 minutes in the breakout groups, and then we'll come back and talk about anything you learned and commitments that you are excited to be making. Welcome back, folks. We're going to give just a few more seconds for the rooms to completely close and everyone to return back to the meeting. Eddie, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you. We hope people had good conversations and reflections and opportunity to share and learn together. We would love to hear in the chat for the next couple minutes kind of what that experience was like, and especially what commitments are you personally, and if you are in an organization or a community space where this can apply, so personally and in the rest of your life, what commitments are you making coming out of this evening? And perhaps what were some of the reflections shared in your small group that most challenged you or most inspired you? So we would love for folks similar to before to put those in the chat. Or Tessa, do we also, is it okay if a couple of folks come off mute and on camera to share?
Yeah, we could do either. Unfortunately, I still don't have any control over my Zoom screen. So if somebody else is able to help with the unmuting, that would be very helpful. And there is a question about the recording. We will have the recording up for tonight's session on our website at aclunc.org/be-the-change within the next week.
And I really appreciate already what people are sharing in the chat, which is I think we all have a lot to learn, is some of the reflections that I'm seeing said in different ways. Yep, excited to learn more, that we needed more time and conversation. If there are folks that want to share verbally, please do raise your hand and we can bring you off mute. Since we didn't have time this evening for questions and answers, a couple of us can stay on after the formal program ends at 6:30, kind of engage in dialogue for a few moments if folks have questions. And I just love seeing kind of the diverse responses that are coming in the chat from people wanting to learn more, people acknowledging that their ancestors have occupied Indigenous lands, trying to bring this to the work that we're already doing, especially work for social justice, encouraging people to take action beyond land acknowledgement. I love that. And just being really real about where we are and how much we have to learn. Thank you for sharing. Talking about it with your children, there are some amazing board books and picture books written and illustrated by Indigenous authors. That as a TIA, I would definitely plug.
There's a shout out for Cafe Aloni. These are great commitments and reflections. Do we want to go to the slide with the resources? And Ted, you could share a little bit about that. And we will be sending these slides out to everyone who attended tonight. If for some reason you don't get them, please send us an email and we can share the slides with you. And then we'll close out the formal program and be available for about 10 minutes for any questions that folks want to ask.
And mostly this list is just some really great, mostly readings, although some also short videos and other resources for more inspiration and more guidance. And thank you all so much. The reflections in the chat are really, really inspiring.
All right, well, Luis, if you want to end the recording. This last slide has my office hours, where basically that just means that you can use the Calendly link to book time with me if you wanted to talk one-on-one, if you wanted to go through this information together and think about how you can bring Indigenous justice and the practice of land acknowledgements into your work and your life. If you have any questions at all, please use that link to book some time with me. And we can end the recording.